Do you want to make your money work harder? Claro is a digital financial coach that helps you to make smart financial decisions and achieve your goals. Claro combines spending analysis, goal setting, saving and investing tools with one-to-one financial coaching to create a bespoke plan that helps you save and invest with confidence and reach your financial goals. So if you want to grow your money and build for your future, sign up for early access at claromoney.co.uk/raise the bar. Hello and welcome to Raise the Bar. I'm Frankie Cotton and this is the weekly podcast that explores business, work and money through honest conversations with women on a mission. My guest this week is Laura Farris. Laura is the Conservative MP for Newbury and co-chair of the Women and Work All-Party Parliamentary Group. Following the Chancellor's 2021 budget announcement on Wednesday, I asked Laura how her party's government plans to support women who have been left behind during the pandemic, particularly those who have failed to receive full SEISS support due to periods of maternity leave and working mothers who have been balancing work and homeschooling. I put your feedback about the consequences of requesting furlough to Laura and ask how we can reverse the gendered impact of the pandemic on women's economic progress, highlighting just how fragile women's equality is when faced with a crisis. This conversation was recorded on the 4th of March 2021. I hope you enjoy listening. If you have a view on anything mentioned in the podcast and would like to share it, you can send an email to podcast@raise_the.bar, or you can join in the conversation online by tagging us at raisehq_ on social media. And lastly, if you're enjoying this podcast series, please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It helps us to be more visible, which ultimately means we can bring you more interviews like this one. Thank you. Laura, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Frankie.
It's a pleasure. Now, Laura, if I may, I'd like to start by reading a section from your foreword to the Women and Work All-Party Parliamentary Group's recent annual report, which says, "As we enter 2021, it is clear that women have suffered disproportionately. Mothers on the lowest incomes are 8 times more at risk of losing their jobs to school closures. 2/3 of working mothers said they were the default parent during lockdown, taking on the bulk of homeschooling and other childcare. And globally, women are disproportionately represented in industries that declined in 2020 due to COVID-19. Policies for recovery and economic stimulus need to incorporate the lived experience of women across the country. All decision-making must be taken through a gendered lens, and if the government fails to do this, we risk leaving women behind." Laura, with that in mind, what was your reaction to the Chancellor's budget announcement yesterday?
I thought there was some good news actually for women's employment, and one of the findings in our report was that there was more than one reason why women's employment had suffered through the crisis. Part of it, as you just read out, was to do with motherhood. We did find that there were women who had either been made redundant voluntarily or who had resigned from their jobs because they just couldn't combine them with homeschooling. And we also found that there was a link with sort of low-paid, insecure employment, sort of part-time roles and so on. But one of the factors that had affected women's employment was sectoral. And it's true to say that women are disproportionately represented in industries like retail, leisure, the beauty industry, hospitality. And all of those industries have been affected by long periods of closure. And it's also true to say that not all of them are going to open the doors again because for whatever reason, the government support wasn't enough, particularly if they had accrued debt actually going into the crisis to manage all their costs. And it was those industries that got quite a big cash injection in the announcement yesterday, particularly hospitality, beauty, anything from the local hairdresser to the local pub can get a grant of up to £18,000. And I know from talking to the small businesses that I represent that will be a kind of, a really important lifeline. So that is really important for women's employment, and also the extension of the furlough till September. Because, when I talk about the pressures on businesses like that, it's often that they can't make their rent. And I think if you add the wage bill on top of that, it makes it really, really difficult for them to to survive. And if the government's going to continue meeting wages for another 6 months, I think it gives them a decent chance of getting back on their feet. And I think that those announcements were specifically good for women's employment.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think they were really great policies, and it was really great to hear about that. I guess one of the main aspects that comes up from our community is really around the self-employed. And really, with SEISS support, it's women who have been on maternity leave recently who are missing out. And a report by Pregnant Then Screwed estimates that it's about 69,000 women in the UK have had reduced income based on the fact that those support payments do not exempt periods of maternity. And I just wondered what you think about that, because it feels quite sexist. And I don't know if you agree or what you think.
Well, look, I don't know if you know this, I used to be a discrimination lawyer, an employment and discrimination lawyer. So I'm quite experienced in looking at these kinds of issues. And I do understand why this has been a sort of red flag for a lot of self-employed women, because you have a baby, you go off, it's much more difficult actually taking maternity leave when you're self-employed, because you have to fund your own mat leave, basically. You have to make a decision about how long you can take before your whatever it is that you do will suffer too much, and you don't have any of the protections that an employee has. And I absolutely recognise that point. I think the difficulty I know that Pregnant Then Screwed are mounting a legal challenge to this. I think the difficulty that they're going to face is this. The government had to get the money out the door very, very quickly when the pandemic hit. I mean, the furlough scheme was designed in about a fortnight, and so was the self-employed income support scheme. And the difficulty, I think, is that not all women who took maternity leave will have taken, for example, the same length of time. There would also be people who, for example, could have had a disability in the last 3 years. For example, cancer automatically qualifies as a disability under the Equality Act. They didn't give discounts for that either. So it wasn't that they sort of chose one category of thing to make more difficult. They just chose a simple method of calculation, which is what your average earnings are over the previous 3 years, and we will give you this money ex gratia as a payment to keep you going. So inevitably, it did fall hard on women who had been on maternity leave, but I can see the challenges in calculation in working out a fair method of that, because of the difference in the amount of time women would be taking if they're self-employed. And also the fact they didn't really make allowances for anyone, even in, even if they'd lost a relative and taken time off for compassionate reasons, or they've been ill and unable to work. They just have very, very simple system to work out a basic calculation and get money out of the door. And I think probably given the kind of emergency nature of it, that was fair in the circumstances. But look, the point that you're making is, did it impact on women more heavily than men who had taken mat leave? Then yeah, I mean, the answer is it did. That's true.
And does the government plan to do anything about that, to adjust that and to make provisions and to sort of backfill that support? Because from the budget announcement yesterday, it didn't appear that was a part of any funding or budgeting.
No, and I don't think that they do, but I think you could look at it another way, which is that the people who are self-employed, there are two considerations. They get two further payments, and we know that the economy is going to begin opening up. I mean, for example, we're just talking about the grants that are available to kind of hospitality and beauty. Beauty can open from the 12th of April. And yet you can still pay your staff through the furlough and or if you're self-employed provider, through those schemes up until the end of September. So in a way, they're continuing to pay even when your business could be operational, but they're recognizing that it'll take time to build up consumer demand and to get your earnings back up. So, in a sense, they're providing an extra cushion. And another thing I think that is relevant is that they're taking into account the 1920 as in last year's tax return. So I think for a lot of people, that will obviously mean another year of earnings that they can then use to work out the average, and that will shift the position for some people. But no, I don't think they're going to go through people's individual circumstances and give them top-ups according to whether they took 6 months in 2018 to have a baby. I think they're stretching out the government support over a period of time rather than taking individual cases. And that's probably right, because there's nearly 3 million people who are receiving the self-employed income support scheme, and I think it would be too costly and onerous to go through them person by person.
Yeah, I guess it's just really difficult because, and this just feels more generally around the pandemic, is that certainly my experience and people that I speak to is it just feels like women's economic equality was actually really fragile, and that there are certain, policies and things that have happened since and during the past year that just make us realize actually, how easy it is to reverse a lot of progress towards equality. And this feels like one of those things. Do you feel the same?
Frankie, I do agree with you actually on that. And I think that the two things that we need to have a conversation about as a society and in Parliament are, firstly, actually, how many women were adversely affected because they were already in jobs that were insecure. So, and this is something I touched on at the beginning, so they were already on a 0 hours contract. Why? Because 0 hours contracts can suit women who want to take time off, for example, for school holidays. If they're doing it with a company that gives them quite a bit of work, they don't need to ask their boss to take time off. They just don't list themselves as available for work during the holiday period. And they adjust their earnings over the year by working out the 30 or so weeks that they will work. But it was often jobs like that were the first to go or were hit the most. Again, part-time workers. They do have protection in law, but those rights are rarely really enforced. People who are with agencies. And we noticed that there was definitely a link between having a more insecure form of employment in the first place and whether or not you would be in work now. And I think that raised really interesting questions about the fact that so many women from the get-go were already working on an employment contract that was less secure than a full-time permanent contract of employment.
And what do you think, from your position as co-chair of the Women and Work APPG, what do you think are some of the solutions to that problem? If employment isn't suiting working mothers, how can we change the systems that basically provide those protections?
I really love all these questions because they're all the things that I've been thinking hard about. And I can't pretend, by the way, Frankie, that I have all the answers, but they are the questions that consume me. So, of course, why do women work on these contracts? The answer is very often linked to kids. They make choices after they've had a baby or more than one baby around not to say childcare. Some of it is wanting to be, it's not just this sort of duty that you have to be there to kind of cook dinner at 5 p.m. It's to do with having a young family. But it does reveal something we have to be honest about, which is that this isn't true of all households. It's not true of my household, actually, but by and large, women are still the primary carers in the home. Women do quite a lot of unpaid domestic work, which is work, and it impacts on the way it impacts on their professional lives. We don't call it work, but it is work. Somebody has to clean the house and, look after the kids and pick them up from school and make dinner and so on. And if often the woman didn't do it, somebody would have to be paid to do it. Some childcare provider would have to do those things for the children. So that is something that I think there are two things that I think really we need to work on. One is more achievable, I think, than the other. The first thing that we know that women value the most in the workplace, and in effect, we've had a 1-year pilot of it for many in many sort of sectors this year, is flexible working. Because if a woman can do her job in a way that allows her to have some autonomy over where she works and how she adjusts her hours, and it doesn't have to mean working from home, although that is one example of it. It could mean a job share, it could mean adjusted shift patterns, it could mean starting early, finishing late, or adjusting your hours around things. Now, it wouldn't work for every single sector and it wouldn't work for every profession, but there are an awful lot of professions where some form of flexibility, including working from home where that's possible in the job concerned, could be a feature. And I've been lobbying pretty hard for improved flexible working rights to appear in the forthcoming employment bill. Now, there's already a right to request flexible working. That's already a statutory protection. But what the government is mulling, and I hope pushing them towards very hard, is that all jobs will be advertised from day one as flexible, with the employer setting the basis on which the flexibility would be apply, unless there is very good reason why the job cannot be done flexibly, and that would be clear in the job ad. So at the point of applying, women would know whether they could do the job, even if there was a 6-month probation where they had to be in all the time, whether or not they were basically entering a potentially flexible job. And I think that would improve women's participation in sort of higher level, more secure roles, because they would know they could do them flexibly. The second thing about the division of labour in the home, firstly, it has improved massively. And even the bit that you read from our report, which is that 2/3 of women were doing the lion's share, the flip side of that is that 1/3 of men were doing the lion's share. And that's not something we'd have said even a generation ago. That's not the life that my mum had. So we need to create the circumstances that move towards sort of men and women sharing, particularly childcare responsibilities. And I think that starts with shared parental leave. And I think to get really good take up of shared parental leaves, we need to have more employers who pay men properly to take some or all of the 1 year allowance that you have. And we need to move to a system where it's normal for a man who has a baby to take a chunk of time off that would affect his career in the same way it would affect a woman, and to, white bottoms and have nappy bags and go to mother and baby, using sexist language, parent and baby groups, and sing Wheels on the Bus and get caught in the rain with a baby that's just been sick. All of that stuff which characterises mat leave for so many women needs to be shared by men. And there are really good examples of employers who give men the opportunity to do it. And I know men who've taken a big chunk of time off, and it's still quite unusual. And it's still something where you're like, oh, that's great if you hear about it, rather than it being totally normal. So I think if you started off with men and women sharing responsibility for the child from absolute infancy, you would move to a more equitable distribution of work duties in the home over time.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And to pick up on your first point about flexible working, is I think there is a concern that for employers and for companies that have had, basically forced flexible working over the past year, is that the results haven't necessarily been great. And there's been a lot of factors as to why that is, obviously economic factors, childcare issues and everything else. But do you think that that's a real concern, this sort of employer trauma almost about the reality of what flexible working looked like, and this sort of, right, once everything opens up again, everybody back to the office, back where we can see you, back where we can retain some level of control? Do you think that's a myth, or do you think that's a genuine concern we should be thinking about?
I think that's an excellent question. I think it's a genuine concern that we should be thinking about. But if I could just unpick some of the things that you said at the start. One of the features of the last year is that it has been obligatory to work from home. It's been mandated by the government. So that has stretched people's resources to the absolute limit, in terms of whether the home laptop and printer sort of works and so on. And it's also been the case that a lot of households have been trying to manage working from home with having the kids at home and trying to give them lessons. So yes, of course, there have been issues around productivity and output, and many employers want to see staff back. And actually, I think it is really important that we have we take a breath after the crisis and people do go back. But I still think there's room for this conversation down the line to think about what would be optimal, assuming normal circumstances where children actually are in school. That flexibility isn't necessarily, in a working from home model, isn't 5 days a week, but it is something that could comfortably happen 1 or 2 days a week, where when I talked about flexible hours, where it might be recognised that an excellent female member of staff might want to get the kids from school at 3:30, but she would be willing to log on again at 6 o'clock and do another couple, and her other half would take over and she'd do another couple of hours of perhaps non-client facing work where she'd catch up on emails, and that could be allowed. And this idea of allowing people more autonomy, as long as they meet their targets, they delivered their objectives, they service the client, and indeed that's the sort of job they do. And if that can't be done 2 days a week, even 1. But I do think there is room when we've got through this crisis. And I take actually and accept, I think, the point you were making about employers having a legitimate expectation that they want everyone in. I still think we can sort of get people back, and then we can pause for thought about the best and worst of the things that we've experienced.
And also, Laura, I'd really like to ask you a bit more about furlough. So the statement that I have here from the Conservative Party's press office is that parents who have struggled to work from home whilst caring for children can apply to be furloughed. But what I'm curious to know from your perspective is, what does this mean in reality? Because first of all, your report says that many women felt that they had lost visibility, or that there was a stigma attached to requesting furlough for childcare. And in terms of comments from our community, we've had some feedback saying, I know parents who have been refused furlough. I also know plenty who aren't asking because it puts them at higher risk of redundancy at a really precarious time. It can create problems for a family, and not to mention, not everyone can afford a 20% drop in salary without going into debt, especially with dependencies, right? So I just wonder, with that as the sort of lived experience, what your view is on how we can actually make this more of a reality for parents.
Well, again, I think your comments are very, very fair, and they certainly reflect some of the kinds of things that my constituents have raised with me in emails. I think that there is a nervousness around furlough now because of the risk of redundancies, and I think it's also true that there are a huge number of employers looking at headcount reductions, and that's because obviously they have to manage their costs, and staff is almost always a prime consideration when adverse economic environment kind of prevails, and that's where we are now. I think that it's sort of difficult talking about it in the context of childcare because the schools do open next week on Monday, and also the early years providers are also open. So this is kind of the end of the road in terms of that. What has, I think, probably the most moving emails I've received have been from women who were refused furlough when they asked for it, and they either made a decision that they were going to resign from their roles, and I did have a few people contact me, and that was obviously incredibly stressful, and then others who didn't resign from their roles, and they had, I've had one or two women, and they sort of their emails haunt me because the pressure they're under really, really resonated. They're trying to homeschool very young kids and do their jobs, and their employers said no. I do think that the pressure that it has placed a unique pressure. And I do also understand why women do think that visibility is important at a time of redundancy. And I have to say, as an employment lawyer, I probably agree with them, actually. I do think the more that you embed in your employer's mind that you are, you're kind of an invisible person in the office, you are creating a degree of exposure in a redundancy exercise. As a matter of sort of human behaviour, I think that is a fair assessment. So, look, I don't really have a perfect answer. We are now moving back into the sort of reopening. I mean, I think from early April, workplaces will open. But so in a way, it's a sort of kind of retrospective concern. I guess during a global pandemic, there are no perfect answers. And most of my thinking now is about creating the conditions for women to thrive and get back into work, rather than I'm not sure I ever really cracked the problem of how they manage jobs and homeschooling. I didn't really come up with the solution.
What, if you don't mind me asking, your sort of personal experience, you're a mother to two. How was it for you? I don't know how old they are, your children, but I wonder, how was it for you personally navigating that? Yeah,
I mean, it's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, and I have to just make one comment. Obviously I do it with my husband, and my children have been for example, in the first lockdown, my youngest is year 1, and you may recall they were one of the first groups back, so I wasn't doing extended homeschooling at any point, but I have thought about single mothers, and I have to say, most single parent households, it is mothers, and I think it would have been literally impossible, actually, to have been a single mum and to have held down a job at the same time and homeschool the kids, in anything more than doing all those things in the most basic and perfunctory way, like sitting your kid down and just praying they sort of follow the worksheet or whatever, because I think it would be impossible to manage all those things if you were on your own.
Yeah. I honestly don't know how single parents have managed, single working parents. It's beyond me. But to pick up on your point, Laura, about looking to the future, and how we can, I guess, start to reverse this impact. I mean, just again to talk numbers, Pregnant Then Screwed have reported that 57% of working mothers believe that managing the childcare responsibilities alongside their paid work during the pandemic has harmed future career prospects. So that's a huge number, 57%. And I wonder, what do you think that the government should do to help to reverse that, both, of course, in the short term, but also what's the long-term impact of that going to look like?
I think that I in some ways, I don't know that I agree with that statement, actually. I completely take the force of the point you made in your previous question about childcare and furlough and time away from the workplace, and that potentially being a factor in future redundancies. But I do think that we will kind of normalise. I think that when the schools are open and things are functioning more as normal, some of that concern will melt away. And I think there's some evidence of that when you look at redundancy so far, which did begin in the middle of last year, we didn't see any spike in the numbers of women who were being made redundant in the autumn period when the schools were back and those women were back in the workplace. In fact, I think the numbers do support the conclusion that unemployment is slightly higher among men than women. And one of the things that has sustained female employment, I think it is important to get this in, is that there are higher numbers of women than men who work in the public sector. And by and large, those jobs haven't been affected. So it's quite difficult to kind of look at to do anything other than look at the big themes. But we didn't see women being sort of punished for the first lockdown during the wave of redundancies that happened in the second half of 2020. And so as yet, the data doesn't support that concern beyond, as I said, I think your point was a very powerful one in the first question about whether or not keeping out of the workplace now makes you more vulnerable. But as yet, as I say, the data doesn't show that yet.
But I guess sort of anecdotally, if you've been struggling with childcare, you've been less visible, you haven't been able to perform so well at work, there might not necessarily be those data points right now that indicate that that's a problem for women. But the impact of that surely will show at some point. So perhaps do you have any particular data points or you know, what are you going to really look at and track to make sure that, you know, those things are being addressed or picked up or noticed over the next, 12, 24 months?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be revealed in unemployment figures. There's not anything that I'm not in government, I'm a backbench MP, so there's not anything I can sort of do. I don't work for the DWP or the Department of Business, but look, I do think I'm identified as somebody who speaks up for female employment a lot in Parliament. And, you know, I mean, the reality is that the only tools that are available to women lie in the Equality Act anyway, which is that if you were, you know, if women who are made redundant because they've had childcare responsibilities would potentially have claims under the Equality Act for indirect discrimination and discriminatory dismissal and rights in the Employment Tribunal. But that isn't the ideal route to go down. You know, you don't want to get people to the point where they're then feeling that they've been discriminated against and are suing their employer. So the government provides those protections in law. But I take the point, which is how do we avoid employers just forming a view and dispensing with them anyway, and whether or not they enforce those rights after a termination is a separate matter. And I'm not sure I have a perfect answer to that, Frankie, to be honest.
Yeah, no, and I don't expect that you do, but I just wonder, I guess the gender pay gap reporting will shed a light on some of this stuff as well, right? And we see if women's progress has changed.
One of the things that isn't said enough about gender pay gap reporting is how much it has prompted employers to change their behaviours. You know, we always get caught in the same row about gender pay gap reporting, which is some people say, oh, you know, it shows that men earn more. And then on the other side, they say, oh, yes, but that's because women opt to do, you know, part-time roles or to work at a lower level because of the family. What they miss is that it actually reveals, particularly with, you know, it's the big employers who are required to do it, that there's a rump of men at the top of the organisation who are in higher level roles and who are earning more. And it's often kind of triggered a really strong response in responsible employers who've looked again at promotional structures and recruitment, and yes, things like flexible working, and whether, you know, well, you don't have young children forever as a woman. It's a chunk of your life, not a permanent state of affairs that when you're 50 you're still going to be worrying about a 7-year-old. And therefore, they've thought much more creatively about whether or not they could perhaps divide the role, or they could put the person still on a managerial pathway over a different time period or with different considerations in place to assess performance. So I think that actually gender pay gap reporting has been really, really powerful in getting employers to reassess the way they promote and recruit. And I think it's also had a bit of it's been a bit of a contagion, because you see the really good employers, and I can think of some examples. I don't want to give names because it almost, you know, I don't know whether I'm allowed to, but some of them have been before Women in Work and have talked about what they've done. And it has been really impressive to see how they've responded. And I think it then shames the employer who does nothing with that data and sort of ignores it, because it reveals a mindset at the top, which I think in a way people are much more alive to and responsive to. And it's a lot of employers want to show a degree of corporate responsibility, and creating the conditions for women to succeed in the same way is an element of that.
And did it concern you that the gender pay gap reporting was put on the back burner during the pandemic? So it was one of the first to sort of go and not be tracked last year. Does that concern you? Because it certainly concerns a lot of people within our community who are worried about that. And not just what the data shows, but the fact that it was just, right, well, that's something that we don't need to do and we don't necessarily see as integral during the pandemic.
Well, I think there's a criticism in there, and I accept it. But look, it was an exceptional year last year, and I do take the view that mandatory gender pay gap reporting is an incredibly powerful tool that the government has been able to has put the boots on the feet of the employers and has made them take action. I'm glad that it returns in a mandatory capacity from October, and I don't think that's a moment too soon. Perhaps I can answer it that way.
Fair enough. Now, Laura, just sort of a bit more broadly, I guess, about your recent report through Women and Work APPG. The theme was women and well-being. And I wonder, in relation to that theme, how a focus on well-being can tangibly affect women's economic equality, do you think?
Frankie, I have to be very honest with you. And I wrote an article in Grazia this week, actually, which dealt with this. When we started the year, the theme of women's well-being, this was decided in January 2020.
Different world.
And a different world, exactly. And we were looking at improving the experience of women in the workplace. And I can't pretend that our work and our sort of lines of inquiry weren't tempered by then what happened. So, some of it was about sort of providing kind of various forms of emotional support to women in the workplace. By the end of the year, all our focus was about what was actually happening to women in the workplace in terms of whether they had a job at all, rather than whether or not. Yeah. So in terms of what we've been looking at, really focusing in relation to the pandemic, it did slightly swamp the other themes, I think, about. We looked at kind of menstrual welfare and so on. There's room for those conversations, but I think we're mainly in crisis mode at this point in time. I think Jess would forgive me for saying that, because we've had conversations about it ourselves where, I think some really interesting themes came out of what we talked about in terms of well-being. But I think we also tried to dissect what was happening to women's employment. As I said, we looked at status, we looked at sectors, we looked at childcare. Those were the kind of big themes, and whether or not the women were in jobs at all. And a lot of that I'm about to say that the messages that you've received and read out do resonate, and they do resemble things that we were thinking about getting in our own inboxes and raising through Women and Work. They're very powerful, those emails from women and their work, their experience in the workplace in the last 12 years. I think it's been actually quite traumatic for some women, really, genuinely. I think I use that word precisely.
Absolutely. And I think that's, I guess when we're looking at returning to our workplaces or returning to some level of normality, is actually well-being and really acknowledging that trauma and those range of experiences is going to be really essential, I think, to building inclusive workplaces. And I guess I just wondered if you have sort of any insights on how we can do that, because certainly I think a lot of the people I talk to see well-being as sort of an add-on or a nice to have or an employee benefit, whereas, if we actually found a way of incorporating it more into the systems of how we work, that would actually fundamentally make such a greater impact, and really would get to the root of some of the problems that realistically we're all going to face when we go back to work.
Well, I think you're right. And to talk in a kind of broad brush type of way, if there was a headline theme that came from well-being, particularly where people sort of were at a crisis point in the workplace. So for the examples that we were looking at the beginning part of the year before everything took hold was around things like domestic abuse situations, or sort of depression and anxiety looming in the workplace, whether that was work related or whether it was colleague related bullying and so on. And one of the things I think that came out of all of that was the importance of early intervention, and how that actually can be so helpful for both employers and employees, because if you have the mechanisms in place, whether that's some form of work support counselling, some form of there are sort of domestic abuse levers where the workplace can provide a really important channel for protecting people who attend work, and there was stuff on that. When those problems are kind of dealt with promptly, and where there is a more holistic approach by the employer, you deal with them much better, and you stop them becoming, intractable workplace problems, which involve in the end the person leaving the workplace, or some really big disruption in the workplace involving multiple members of staff. That was definitely a really important takeaway, and the amount of kind of sort of support and investment that employers provide in that regard does have a material effect on the kind of well-being and and the job satisfaction actually that people get from their workplace. And I think another thing it really reminds me, sorry, I won't go on, but people always think the most important thing or the only thing that matters in the workplace is pay. And actually all the surveys do show, of course, it is the most important thing. But so many of the secondary qualities, which are, a very, very close second, are about the culture of the workplace and about the way that the management structures operate and about whether or not you feel listened to or noticed or respected.
Now, Laura, I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about your background getting into politics. So maybe for somebody who's listening to this podcast thinking, I really want to get into politics, I'm considering it as a career path, what advice would you give to them, and how did you enter this path?
So it is, I know this sounds very cheesy, but it is an unbelievable privilege to represent your area in Parliament. It's an unbelievable privilege. Even walking through the gates into New Palace Yard through the security with your pass on and going up into the chamber and taking your seat with your constituents in mind and their issues and making a speech about them is actually quite an emotional thing to do. I was born in my constituency, so I did move to London when I left uni, but it's where my mum is. This is my home. And I don't know that there is anyone in Parliament, whatever their politics, who would disagree with that kind of emotional core. It is an incredible job, really incredible. And it is also incredible how far your voice can kind of reverberate, even when you're a complete nobody like me. So I'll give you one example. I did a cross-party campaign on the rough sex defence that has been brought into the domestic abuse bill. The government accepted our amendment. And that came about because of a case. My interest in it came about because of a case that I read about. Actually, I read about it, I think, in a magazine or online or something, which was about a woman who had been beaten black and blue by her husband her partner, and there'd been very serious sexual violence. And she died. She was called Natalie Connolly, and her partner had successfully basically established that she was sort of up for it, and he ended up getting 18 months on a manslaughter conviction. And that was about a year and a half before I became an MP, and I remember reading it and my blood boiling at the kitchen table at the injustice of the case. And it felt like a very powerful thing to kind of tell her story in Parliament. I have to say there were other MPs doing the same thing, including Mark Garnier, who's her family's MP. But making that speech in 2 or 3 minutes, getting the law changed to resolve that, the difference between just being a passive bystander who feels a strong view about things and being able to stand in your national parliament and articulate them, and then for that clip to go on social media and to get swept up and snowball, does make you realise how effective your voice can be and how important actually it is to kind of put yourselves forward. And I also think, I know this is another cheesy line, it's very hard not to just fall into the cliches, but there are enough women in politics. It can add a different perspective. It doesn't have to be always constant raging battle of kind of partisan politics, but you can add nuance and your experience. And the truth of the matter is that even though the numbers are better, women's voices are still quite new. They haven't had large numbers of women MPs in Parliament really until the last decade. And that means lots of terrain that hasn't been covered properly, that needs to be scrutinised and looked at. And if you're so inclined, I think there's a good opportunity for cross-party working. It makes it harder for the government to ignore if people agree across the floor.
Definitely. Well, Laura, thank you so much. And I really appreciate you, really honestly answering all of my questions. It's been great to chat with you. I just want to give you, thank you. I just want to give you the opportunity. Is there anything that we've not discussed or talked about today that maybe you want to leave us on or pass on to the listeners?
I don't have any more kind of big headline things that I want to say, but what I do want to say actually is that the experiences of women are so important for informing the work that we do in Parliament. The examples you read out, what I see in my inbox, and the Women in Work APPG is a very responsive one. And so if anyone listening to that wants to contact, you can just drop me a line through my parliamentary email or Jess Phillips, and you want to flag things that Women in Work should consider, which have been your experience of the pandemic, I would really urge your listeners to do so, because we, as I say, we do try to be really responsive, and we don't have every problem on our radar unless people bring it to our attention. So it's helpful to hear from your listeners.
Great. Well, thank you, Laura. I'm going to let you go and crack on with the busy day ahead. Thanks for listening to Raise the Bar. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on your favourite podcast app and spread the word. You can join in the conversation online using the hashtag #RaiseTheBar and tagging us at RaiseHQ_ on social media. And you can find all the details about our brilliant guests in the show notes. See you next week.